History remembers the victors. But what if the victors rewrote the soul of the world? What if, when the Western empires rose, one ancient code refused to die, and instead conquered time itself? Chapter 1. The Ashes of Edo. When the black ships arrived on the horizon in 1853, history was supposed to bend. Japan was meant to open its gates, bow to trade, and let the West flood in like a tide. But in this world, it didn't. The Tokugawa Shogunate saw the steam and steel of the outsiders and called it a new kind of sword. Instead of surrender, they adapted. Japanese engineers, guided by foreign blueprints and samurai discipline, forged a technology of their own: clockwork rifles, armored gliders, and silent ships that cut through fog like blades. Isolation didn't lead to weakness. It became focus. The emperor remained divine, the shogun his hand, and Bushido, the way of the warrior, evolved into the law of the nation. The samurai, once a caste, became an idea. That duty outweighed desire, that honor was sharper than any sword. While Europe argued over democracy, Japan built unity out of silence. In the ashes of Edo's old world, a new capital rose: Shinkyo, the city of the spirit. Its streets ran with lantern light and iron rails, temples beside factories, monks chanting to the rhythm of pistons. Foreign envoys came with treaties. They left in awe or fear, for they saw something they couldn't name, a civilization that had become a weapon. The shogunate declared the night doctrine, that light blinds the weak, but the night belongs to those who see through darkness. Thus began an empire not of conquest, but of conversion. Across Asia, kingdoms sent emissaries to learn the new code. Bushido spread like fire through silk, into Siam, into India, into the trembling heart of Europe. The samurai spirit, once confined to sword and shrine, was becoming the soul of a new world. But every dawn has its shadow, and in the quiet of Shinkyo's temples, a whisper began: "If all obey, who dares to dream?" The ashes of Edo burned bright, but beneath the flame, something human began to fade. Chapter 2. The Code of the World. Bushido Ascendant. The year was 1910, and the world had learned to bow. No single war had been fought, no blood-soaked conquests, no colonial massacres written in ink and shame. Japan had done something far more enduring. It had conquered philosophy. The code of Bushido, once the oath of the samurai, had transformed into the law of civilization. At its heart were 8 sacred virtues: gi, integrity; rei, respect; yu, courage; meiyo, honor; jin, compassion; makoto, sincerity; chu, loyalty; and sei, purity. In the empire's schools, children memorized these before learning numbers. In its courts, judges recited them before passing sentence. And far beyond Japan's islands, the world began to change. Europe's monarchs, desperate to restore order after decades of revolutions, adopted the Bushido Charter, believing that obedience was the cure for chaos. Industrialists in Berlin and London quoted samurai maxims to their workers. A sword is useless without discipline. Even America, fractured and weary of its own freedom, sent emissaries to Shinkyo to study the Japanese way. Bushido had become contagious, the moral virus of the century. It promised clarity where democracy offered doubt, unity where capitalism sowed greed. And under its growing shadow, nations began to reshape themselves. The Samurai Council was formed, a circle of generals, monks, philosophers, and engineers who guided the emperor's dream of world harmony. They declared that violence was barbaric unless it served balance, that technology must mirror nature and power must honor silence. Factories across the empire worked like monasteries. Workers bowed before machines as if they were shrines. Every invention, from the clockwork samurai armor to the first mechanical dragonfly scouts, carried the emperor's sigil, a black chrysanthemum blooming against a crimson sun. Bushido was not merely taught, it was lived. In Paris, poets replaced rhyme with haiku. In Moscow, soldiers prayed before battle. In New York, skyscrapers rose not as monuments of greed, but as offerings of symmetry, disciplined, austere, almost divine. The world was becoming elegant and cold. Individuality began to decay, dismissed as weakness. Art without purpose was outlawed. Laughter without restraint was vulgar. The idea of the self, once the center of Western thought, was quietly executed in the name of peace. And yet, beneath the order, the cracks had begun to show. Merchants whispered that the emperor's envoys didn't trade, they dictated. Teachers wondered why compassion was fading, even as purity was praised. And somewhere deep within Shinkyo, a young monk named Kaito Renji wrote forbidden words. When honor rules the heart, mercy dies first. The samurai council condemned him to silence, but his verse spread like wildfire through secret channels, copied by students, whispered by lovers, scrawled on temple walls. Bushido, the code that had once united the empire, was becoming its own kind of cage. Still, the world celebrated Japan as its moral compass. The West had lost its faith in God. Now it believed in the sword. The sun never set on the empire, not because it ruled the earth, but because it ruled the mind. And somewhere, far beyond the glow of lanterns and logic, the last free spirits began to ask a dangerous question. If everyone lives by honor, who decides what honor means? As the emperor gazed from his iron palace atop Mount Aoi, he saw a world kneeling, beautiful, ordered, and silent. He believed he had brought peace, but in truth, he had only lengthened the night. Chapter 3. The Iron Chrysanthemum. By the dawn of the 20th century's third decade, the empire had become something more than a nation. It was a mechanism. The world moved to its rhythm, and its heart beat in Shinkyo, beneath the iron petals of a new age. Factories were temples now. Monks chanted beside machines, their prayers synchronizing with pistons and press hammers. Steam hissed like breath in meditation. Sparks rose like offerings to the gods of precision. The old swordsmiths of Kyoto no longer forged katana. They shaped carbon steel into exoskeletal armor, the kensei frames, whose blades could split a rifle round mid-flight. The samurai still existed, but they no longer rode horses, they rode thunder. At the center of this age bloomed the symbol of perfection, the iron chrysanthemum. Its petals, made of alloy and shadow, represented unity between man and machine, spirit and discipline. It was more than an emblem, it was an ideology. To the empire, the chrysanthemum was not just beauty, it was control made holy. The emperor's scientists built marvels the West could not replicate. Wind-powered gliders that soared without engines, steel nerves that linked entire cities through silent communication threads. Electricity flowed like prayer, rationed not by need, but by moral standing. Those who served the code faithfully were granted warmth and light. Those who questioned it lived in deliberate dusk. Abroad, nations imitated what they could not resist. Berlin's engineers studied captured automata and failed to replicate their grace. New York's businessmen adopted Bushido principles in their contracts. Honor is payment, they wrote, without knowing what it meant. Parisian architects designed buildings with the symmetry of temples, hollow at the center like the eyes of statues. And yet, behind all this precision, something began to rot. The empire's perfection demanded sacrifice, not of blood, but of humanity. Artists were forced into silence. Writers were told that stories must end in obedience. Laughter became subversive. The office of rectitude, an order of philosopher-administrators, enforced morality through surveillance that was never seen yet always felt. They measured citizens not by wealth, but by harmony, how still their hearts beat, how steady their voices spoke. To falter in rhythm was to betray the empire. But cracks appeared in the silence. In the underground of Shinkyo, whispers returned. Renji's verse, "If a petal will not bend, must the flower break?" The words appeared like ghosts, on mirrors, on chalkboards, on the walls of the sleepless. The inspectors erased them, but the words reappeared each dawn. A rebellion was growing, not in armies, but in ideas. Still, the empire projected calm. Its fleets moved through the clouds, silent airships gleaming like celestial carp. Cities below reflected their shapes in rivers lined with lanterns. Everywhere, people bowed. Everywhere, the code held, unchallenged, serene, suffocating. The emperor, now an old man wrapped in ceremonial armor, believed he had achieved balance. He had built a world where war no longer existed, where duty had conquered desire. But he did not see what was coming. That silence, too, can be a storm. The iron chrysanthemum bloomed too perfectly, and like every perfect thing, it left no room for life to breathe. As the factories hummed and the airships drifted above the Pacific, the world seemed at peace. But deep within that peace, something began to hum off-key. Faint, human, and unstoppable. The empire had mastered order. Now it was about to meet its first taste of chaos. Chapter 4. The Fall of the West. By the middle of the 20th century, the West had become a mirror, and mirrors, when left too long in the dark, crack from their own reflection. The samurai empire did not conquer through invasion, it conquered by example. Its perfection was contagious, a kind of moral gravity that pulled nations inward until they forgot how to stand alone. The iron chrysanthemum had spread across oceans, stamped on treaties, passports, and even coins. The West no longer feared the empire's armies. It feared its philosophy. In London, factories no longer roared with the chaos of ambition. They hummed in the measured rhythm of Bushido efficiency. The British Crown, desperate for relevance, signed the Concord of Discipline, a pact aligning its industries with the imperial standard. Union strikes vanished overnight. Protest became disharmony. And in schools from Manchester to Madrid, children began each day not with prayer, but with the recitation of the 8 virtues. Across the Atlantic, America fractured under its own contradictions. Freedom had made it rich, but also restless. The idea of endless choice had become unbearable in a world that promised perfection through obedience. Corporations adopted imperial models of conduct. Senators quoted samurai codes in their speeches. By 1952, Washington signed the Treaty of Shinkyo, officially recognizing Bushido ethics as a universal framework for human governance. The Statue of Liberty stood still, but in her shadow, men and women bowed. And so, without a single shot fired, the rising sun reached the edge of the world. But harmony, like glass, can only bend so far. As the empire's influence deepened, Western art and science began to suffocate. Music lost its dissonance, painting lost its chaos. Even love, once reckless, messy, sacred, became a transaction of honor and debt. Poets burned their own work for fear of disharmony. Historians rewrote the past to erase the very word rebellion. In this new world, the West had no villains, only failures, and every failure was a moral crime. Still, the human heart does not yield easily. In Paris, underground jazz clubs reopened, not as entertainment, but as defiance. In Berlin, graffiti artists painted cracked chrysanthemums on walls, symbols of beauty marred by truth. In New York, a woman named Lydia Cross began broadcasting secret recordings, distorted readings of banned Western poets set against the hum of imperial transmissions. Her final message, before the Rectitude Corps silenced her signal, was a whisper heard across continents. A world without chaos is a world already dead. The Emperor's council declared her words treasonous, yet could not erase them. They lingered, in memory, in dreams, in the uneasy pauses of conversation. The world was beginning to remember that silence, too, is a sound. Meanwhile, within the empire, the first signs of fracture appeared. The Kensei Corps, once the holy arm of order, began to split between loyalists and skeptics. Some soldiers, weary of enforcing peace through fear, vanished into the mountains of Hokkaido, calling themselves the Silent Blades. They believed Bushido had been corrupted, turned from a code of personal virtue into a machinery of control. Their creed was simple. To serve the way, one must disobey the empire. But rebellion was still unthinkable on a global scale. No nation dared to rise. The West had fallen not in war, but in spirit, its courage traded for calm, its freedom for symmetry. And yet, somewhere beneath the perfect order, something ancient was stirring. Dreams. Dreams of noise, of color, of imperfection. Children born into silence began to hum. Writers started using ink that bled on purpose. The world's perfect rhythm faltered by a single beat, but it was enough. The Emperor's astronomers reported strange anomalies. Solar flares, unpredicted eclipses, the sun dimming in fragments. The court poets called it the night eating the dawn. But in the alleys of Shinkyo, whispers carried another name. The world that kneels is beginning to stand. The iron chrysanthemum had conquered the earth, but now the first cracks had bloomed within its own petals. Chapter 5. The Silent Rebellion. They called it the Age of Stillness, the years when no nation dared to fight, no citizen dared to dream, and the world spoke only in the language of obedience. But beneath that stillness, something fragile and human began to move again. It started with whispers, not shouts, not protests, not banners, just words, small, secret, dangerous words, carried on paper, coded into art, woven into melody. The rebellion was born not in fire, but in silence. In the back alleys of Shinkyo, where the lamplight never reached, the poet Kaito Renji returned from legend. His name had been erased from history, but his verses lived on in the cracks of the empire. He gathered a circle of thinkers, artists, and former soldiers who called themselves the Ink Guild. They didn't raise swords, they raised ideas. Their creed was simple. If the world must kneel, let it kneel to beauty. They wrote haiku that didn't praise the emperor. They painted chrysanthemums with missing petals. They composed songs that broke the imperial rhythm. One beat too soon, or one note too long. To the untrained ear, it was imperfection. To those who understood, it was defiance. Across the world, others joined without ever meeting them. In Berlin, a pianist played with both hands out of sync, calling it freedom. In Rio, street performers danced without symmetry. In Tokyo itself, a group of school children refused to bow in unison, and for that, they were exiled. Their names vanished from records, but the act became legend. The emperor's government responded with precision. The Rectitude Corps tightened its inspection cycles. Dissenters disappeared into the silent prisons, echo-proof chambers deep beneath Mount Aioi, where even thought seemed to fade. The empire called it purification. But the more it purified, the more the infection of freedom spread. For the first time in generations, the perfect machine faltered. Trains missed their schedule by seconds. Airship lights flickered against the sky. Computers miscalculated their algorithms by margins too small to explain. Mathematicians called it quantum drift. The priests called it karma. The rebels called it hope. Meanwhile, the emperor, now a frail shadow of his younger self, grew haunted by the ghosts of order. He dreamed of a vast garden of metal flowers, each petal inscribed with a face he could not remember. When he tried to count them, they whispered his own name back to him. The samurai council, fearful of unrest, demanded harsher enforcement. But among their own ranks, cracks began to show. Some of the Kensei warriors refused to strike unarmed poets. They claimed that Bushido itself forbade such dishonor. Others, bound by oaths, obeyed, but their eyes trembled behind their visors. The code that once unified them was now tearing them apart. One night, a new sound swept through Shinkyo, a song. It began as a hum in the Undercity, carried by a child's voice. No one knew who started it, but by dawn, the melody had spread through the city, across markets, temples, even the palace walls. The lyrics were simple, forbidden, and final. We are the silence that speaks. We are the stillness that moves. We are the shadow the sun forgot. The empire tried to erase it. They banned all music. They burned instruments. But the sound remained, in memory, in breath, in the beating of hearts. The silent rebellion had no generals, no banners, no battlefields. It was everywhere and nowhere, as unstoppable as thought. By the end of that year, the emperor's ministers reported what they could not deny. Order remains, but meaning does not. For the first time, the iron chrysanthemum trembled. Its petals, flawless and cold, began to rust from within. Not from attack, but from the return of life. The empire had built a world without chaos. Now, chaos had learned to whisper back. Chapter 6. The Night of the Emperor. The night the emperor finally dreamed of the sun, it did not rise. For 40 years, he had ruled a world that no longer bled. He had conquered conflict, silenced rebellion, perfected order. But as the silent rebellion spread like unseen fire through the empire, the perfection he built began to waver. Not from war, but from within his own soul. The emperor had grown old, a pale figure framed in armor he no longer had the strength to wear. Each dawn he watched from the balcony of the palace of still waters, where no wind dared to blow. The sky was always clear, the city below symmetrical, rows of quiet streets, lanterns glowing in identical intervals. To any eye, it was paradise. To him, it was a tomb. He began to speak less to his ministers and more to the ghosts that haunted him. Sometimes, the guards would hear him whisper the names of people long erased from the archives. Renji, Lydia, the children of the bow. Sometimes he asked questions that frightened his council. If harmony is perfect, why does the heart still tremble? If obedience is virtue, who forgives the obedient? The priests called it fatigue. The council called it heresy. But the emperor called it truth. He summoned the samurai council for one last assembly in the Hall of Eternal Order. Their armor shone like mirrors beneath the artificial sun lamps. The emperor spoke with the calm of a dying god. "We have built a world without chaos. We have banished war, silence, hunger, and choice. But in doing so, we have unmade man himself." The hall fell silent. No one dared to respond. Then, from the back of the chamber, General Takashi, commander of the Kensei Corps, stepped forward. He removed his helmet and knelt. "Your Majesty, the world bows to you. If men are broken, it is because they are weak. Order is the only mercy left." The emperor studied him for a long moment. Then he said, almost gently, "And if mercy demands we end the order?" Takashi hesitated. All his life he had known only duty, the blade's edge between loyalty and fear. He bowed lower, unable to answer. That night, the emperor dismissed the council and ordered the palace sealed. He walked alone through its corridors, past statues of ancient warriors, past tapestries that told the story of the iron chrysanthemum's rise. In the great courtyard, the air smelled of iron and incense. Above him, a full moon hung motionless, as if afraid to move. From the shadows emerged a small figure, a monk in tattered robes. It was Kaito Renji. Older now, face lined by years of exile and defiance. No one knew how he had entered the palace. Perhaps the guards had allowed it. Perhaps the emperor himself had willed it. "Renji," said the emperor softly, "you wrote the verse that began all this." Renji bowed. "No, my lord. I only wrote what was already in your heart." The two men stood in silence for a long time. Then the emperor asked, "Can a world built on obedience ever learn to forgive itself?" Renji's reply was a whisper. "Only if it remembers how to disobey." The moonlight flickered. The wind stirred for the first time in years. That night, the emperor walked to the balcony one last time. The horizon was dark. No stars, no sun, no dawn. He looked down at the city, glowing with perfect geometry, and saw it for what it truly was: a garden without fragrance, a life without pulse. He raised his hand, not in command, but in release. The signal went out across the empire, through circuits, temples, and machines, a single word encoded in the ancient imperial script: enough. Power grids shut down. Airships drifted silently to Earth. The machines that had sung for decades fell quiet. For the first time in centuries, the world heard itself, the rustle of leaves, the breath of people, the sound of wind moving through forgotten trees. At dawn, the emperor was found seated beneath the great chrysanthemum emblem, eyes closed, face at peace. The cause of death was never declared. The priests said he ascended. The rebels said he awakened. The world said nothing at all. That was the night the sun truly set. And perhaps the first time in history, the empire saw the beauty of its own darkness. Chapter 7. The Dawn That Never Came. The sun did not rise the next morning, not because the earth had changed its course, but because humanity no longer knew how to look for light. When the emperor's final signal, "Enough," spread across the networks of the world, silence fell like rain. Machines stopped. Airships sank gently into the seas. Cities once filled with the hum of order were now still, breathing for the first time in centuries. No alarms, no commands, no orders, only wind. The empire of the samurai had ended without a battle. And in its ashes, the people discovered something terrifying: freedom. At first, they didn't know what to do. Without the voice of the emperor, there was no schedule, no command, no purpose. The soldiers stood in formation for days, waiting for orders that never came. Monks wept at empty shrines. Citizens wandered through the streets like ghosts, unsure if the world was dying or being born. In Shinkyo, vines began to crawl up the sides of the iron towers. Rusted trains slept in their stations. Children drew shapes on the dust-covered walls, uneven, imperfect, alive. A woman sang softly in the market, and no one silenced her. It was the first song of the new age. Across the former empire, nations awakened one by one. In London, people tore the chrysanthemum banners from their walls and burned them, not in hatred, but in mourning. In New York, the old jazz clubs reopened. The first melody played there was broken, trembling, and utterly human. In the mountains of Kyoto, the surviving samurai removed their armor and laid their swords on the ground, blades facing the earth. They no longer called themselves warriors. They called themselves keepers of the silence, guardians of what the world had learned through suffering. Years passed. No new emperor was crowned. The samurai council dissolved, its members retreating into anonymity. The world slowly rebuilt, not in the image of order, but of balance. Cities became smaller. Temples opened their doors to poets. The factories that once forged weapons now forged instruments, delicate machines that hummed not for war, but for wonder. And yet, even in this fragile peace, the memory of the empire lingered, like an old scar that still ached when the weather changed. The scholars who studied the past debated endlessly. Had the emperor freed the world or destroyed it? Was Bushido a code of virtue that men corrupted, or a weapon disguised as wisdom? The historians called it the Long Twilight, the century that followed the fall, when humanity lived between night and dawn, uncertain of which would come next. One manuscript survived from that era, written in the emperor's own hand. It was found decades later, sealed inside a black chrysanthemum carved from iron. The pages were few, but the words were unlike any sermon or decree. They were a confession. I sought perfection to protect mankind from chaos. But perfection is only another kind of death. The sword that defends the world also divides it. Perhaps the truest empire was never mine to rule, but the one that blooms in a single heart when it learns to forgive itself. When the archivists read it aloud, the world listened in silence. No one wept, no one cheered. It was not the end of a story, only the end of forgetting. As centuries passed, legends blurred into myth. Children heard tales of the samurai empire that ruled the night, of a world lit by discipline and undone by beauty. Some believed the emperor had become a spirit, watching over mankind. Others said he still walked among them, nameless, reborn in every soul that struggled between duty and desire. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind passes through old ruins and the moonlight glints off rusted steel, it almost sounds like a whisper. The night remembers, the empire sleeps, and the dawn that never came waits still.